Just want to welcome everyone to today's webinar. Please feel free to, in the chat box, just write where you're from, what your name is, or what your focus of work is, and why today's webinar would be interesting for you. We have a special guest today, Rushka Ely from the EDP, the Western Cape Economic Development Partnership with us here in Cape Town. And she'll be sharing some of her work that she's been doing over the last couple of years. And I actually stumbled on her work through some tweets. And so she's a kind of an influencer, and she's written a lot in the Daily Maverick as well. So I've just sort of, her name and her tweets and her writing has been, and her work's been sort of propping up all over. Especially also during the time of COVID. Rushka's work's been quite influential in public spaces and also in NGOs and community-based organizations. So just to formally introduce, sort of welcome you, this is the Thursday webinars we've been having at the Center for Sustainability Transitions since the last year. We have these twice a month on a Thursday. And basically the focus is on sharing people's work that has been, how they've been sort of adapting and changing and experiencing also what this means to be flexible, adaptive, transformative, innovative in a time of COVID in our local organizations, dealing with complexity and resilience and sustainability. And I think there's been such a huge positive response to this webinar series that we've been fortunate to continue with this. And I think it's been a lovely space, and there's a lovely energy around it that sort of just developed spontaneously around these themes. And just also to remind you that the webinars are recorded and then they're posted on our CST website under the videos tab. All the videos are there, and I've also seen that some of these videos have been shared or watched more than 100 times, 200 times. So there's kind of a buzz around this, and we're really excited about that. So just to welcome you to today's theme, we have Rushka Ely with us, and the theme is Rethinking Public Governance for Systemic Change. And she'll be sharing some of the work she's been doing at the Western Cape Economic Development Partnership for the last 10 years or so, and in the wider area. Rushka, wonderful that you're with us today, and thank you so much. I wrote you in a cold call email. You didn't know me, and you still responded to my email. Thank you very much for that. Would you mind just sort of introducing yourself? We have your information that we've shared on the flyer, that you've been a development practitioner for a long time, and that you're working with specific focuses and challenges. But yeah, just tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, where you're working, what are you involved with, before we introduce today's theme further.
Thanks, Rika, so much, firstly, for the invitation. I'm very excited to be here. So as Rika says, my name is Rushka Ely. I don't know how much of an influence I am. My 14-year-old would probably disagree with that wholeheartedly. But yeah, so I've been working in the public sector now for just over, I would say, 6 or 7 years. And I started kind of out working in Western Cape government in looking at kind of green economy and green economic projects and policies and strategies and things like that before I moved on to work for the EDP. So the EDP, I mean, I would say we're quite a unique organization. We funded by government, so we're a non-profit company funded mainly by Western Cape government. But the role that we play is about, it's creating spaces for testing new ways of responding to old, kind of long-standing issues. And my work specifically at the EDP has been focused on local government. So I've done a lot of work in the local government space of late, both in terms of looking at your rural municipalities as well as, working with the city there. And the key question of interest for us is the one that we're discussing today, which is very much about, what is looking at governance in a new way look like? And I think that's when you come to the crux of it, that's really the EDP's work more broadly. It's about bringing people together in a new way. It's about collaboration, all of the things that require us to think in a kind of systemic way about our issues, and require us to that we're required to do in order to be responsive to the complex systems that we work in. And then, you know, kind of aside from that, a project that I had the pleasure of being a part of over this past year is the Catalyzing Change program. So this is a program run by the Stockholm Resilience Center, funded by the Swedish Institute. And it's focused on building the capabilities of public sector officials in Africa to kind of, you know, to be change makers in this context of uncertainty, complexity, and kind of dispersed power dynamics. And that's been a great journey, which a lot of the kind of things that I'll be sharing today have also been, my thinking around that has been crafted in that space as well.
Yeah, thank you very much for sharing that. Yeah, I get what you say about your 14-year-old. If they're watching YouTube videos, people get more than 1 million hits. How do we get that right? What are we doing wrong? So no, thank you. I think, yeah, it's just amazing to see the creative ways and to hear about the creative ways you're thinking about partnership, collaboration, using a space that is kind of a bridging space or interface for connecting different people could be extremely challenging. And just to think, yeah, the creative and the innovative ways of working and doing that you've been, yeah, exposed to and sort of championing here in the Western Cape. I think we have a number of people also that's joining us from sort of in the north of the country. We have some projects on development work on, sort of in the Limpopo area and transboundary area. So I think it's always great to hear what's working in different spaces and then trying to learn from that as well. So we also just want to say welcome to everyone that's joining us from other parts of the country. Yeah, so Rushka, please, I don't want to take more of the time. Please share with us your presentation that you prepared. And I think you also said that you'd love to engage more with people after your presentation. So for those of you listening, joining us, feel free to just share ideas and comments sort of in the chat or in the Q&A, and we'll have a look for that. And we'll give, there'll be ample chance afterwards to have some conversation about the work, the ideas that Rushka shared with us. So please share your screen.
Okay, can you see that, Rika?
Yes.
Fantastic. So, yeah, I titled this presentation Rethinking Public Governance, mainly because, as I said, this is something that the EDP has been quite interested in for the last couple of years, but also I think because I wanted to very specifically say that this is something that we're thinking about. So I'm not, my presentation today, you will see, is more telling a story about what we've learned through our practice. I'm not presenting this as the practice. I don't imagine that there is best practice. I think in best case, we have emergent practice. And I think that's all we'll ever have, you know, working in these kinds of systems that we find ourselves in. So I wanted to state that up front because I'd really love to invite everyone to engage critically with what I'm presenting. I'd love us to create a platform where we can learn from each other. I don't have all the answers and I don't claim to. So I'd love to, more than anything, hear what people think about our experiences and the lessons that we've learned, and also your own experiences. So I want to start by asking the question, well, what do we mean by governance, right? It feels like a very loaded word. And, you know, in the Catalyzing Change program, I ran a very similar session to this. And I asked the participants there to tell me what they thought we meant by governance and what governance is supposed to be. And so they came up with a couple of responses that I'll share with you. So they said that governance is about ticking the boxes. They said it's about decision making. So governance tells us who gets to decide what. They said it's about clean audits. It's about being responsible. It's about participation and transparency. And mostly what people kind of said it was about accountability. It was about compliance. And so I came across this cartoon recently. I'm a big fan of bringing humor into work. That for me quite summed this up, right? And this is this one. You have a bunch of executives sitting around a boardroom table, and they say, "It's agreed then. Our new company motto is we didn't do anything illegal." And I feel like for a long time, that's what we see governance as. It's about being risk averse. It's about making sure we're not doing anything illegal, that we're being accountable, you know, and that we're being compliant and all of those kinds of things. But I mean, is that all that governance could be? So this is kind of the key question, right? That we have in our minds. And I want to draw your attention to this book that I was introduced to recently. It's by James P. Cass. He's a religious studies professor. And he wrote this book called Finite and Infinite Games. And essentially he says that in life, we generally play two games. So the first kind of game is a finite game. And finite games, we play to win, right? The second kind of game we play is infinite. So these are games we play with the specific objective to keep playing the game. So if you think about, say, for example, a soccer play. So someone playing soccer is very much a finite game. The rules of the game are clear. They don't generally change very significantly. The playing field doesn't change. So even though the venue might change, things like that, the soccer fields are generally standard from my limited knowledge of soccer and things like that. And the roles don't change. So there's always a goalkeeper. There's always a striker and other, you know, the roles are standard no matter where you're playing soccer. And the objective is always to win. So there's a clear end. But let's look at maybe the example of a family. So in a family, you could say that these guys are then playing an infinite, right? So there's no hard rules. It changes with the context. So, I mean, depending on the dynamics of that family, depending on how people move through that family, there are kind of principles that people buy into, but there are no hard rules that says this is how you play family. The playing field constantly shifts. So as a family goes through the throes of life, the playing field shifts. The roles evolve. So someone could, you know, be a child in a family and then become the parent in a family. And so the roles are constantly evolving as the context evolves. And the objective is to actually keep playing the game. So there's no end to the game. And in fact, the objective is almost to add new players to the game as you're going on. And I found this quite interesting because I was like, okay, so what if we thought about governance as an infinite game? So there's an example that I want to put to you that I'm actually stealing from my professor, Brian Levy, who told me this as a story about in 2006, the World Bank published this document. And it was a document that kind of laid out the best practice for the governance of SOEs, right, in developing countries. And if you kind of go into kind of what they were saying in summary, they said, well, the best practice for governance of SOEs In terms of the legal form, it looks like, you know, where SOEs have the same legal form as other commercial enterprises. In terms of how they set the objectives should be as clear as possible. They should be about maximizing the enterprise's value. There should be like clear guidance on where trade-offs happen between objectives when there are multiple objectives. When they spoke about the kind of organization of the ownership function, it was kind of like the state has ownership rights, and there should be an established kind of dedicated ownership entity separate from the state. And that the mechanisms through which the state could monitor the SOE's performance should be through nomination of board, overseeing the policy objectives, setting performance agreements, etc. They also gave guidance on the board of directors. They said a board of directors should be given the responsibility to make strategic decisions for the SOE. There should be a structured and transparent nomination process to make sure that the board is kind of that it's a transparent and accountable. There's accountability built into that process. And then in terms of how the SOE should disclose its kind of performance, they said that they should have internal controls and be subject to an external audit. If it's listed on the stock exchange, it should have the same kinds of external audits as other listed companies, etc., etc. So I looked at this and I was like, okay, well, of course, right? That's kind of sure, right? And then Brian went on to say that the World Bank had developed this best practice model by looking at a particular country. So they studied one country in depth. And this was a country that they thought had really gotten it right in terms of thinking about the governance structure for state-owned enterprise. Does anyone want to guess what that country is? If you didn't already, that country was in fact South Africa. So this was in 2006. The World Bank had released an entire document saying everyone should look to South Africa because they've gotten it right in terms of how to set up a governance structure for SOEs. And we know 2 years later, in 2008, ESCOM crisis hit us, and since then, you know, things have unraveled quite significantly. So then, what does this tell us about governance? And if we accept that governance is an infinite game, you know, for me, when I looked at this, I was like, well, of course that happened. Because what I found is that if governance is an infinite game, but that table of kind of guidelines were all kind of finite rules. They were things that on a list, you can tick it off. Okay, we've got a board of directors. We're compliant with audits and things like that. So they applied very finite rules to what is in fact an infinite game. And so then if we say, okay, this is an infinite game, how do we maybe create enabling constraints in the way we do governance? So this term, enabling constraints, was coined by Lauren Hermanus, who's the director of ADAPT. And as much as it sounds like a misnomer, I really responded to this because it's about saying, you know, we always think about governance in the way of how do we stop people from doing something? And in fact, if we think about governance as well, how do we enable people to do something? It becomes a very different kind of conversation. So how do we have that conversation? And then related to that, how do we boundary the system of relationships, you know, in our system in a way that actually leverages those relationships towards systems change? And this is kind of the stuff of the EDP work. right? It's grappling really with these two questions. And so you might say, okay, that's all good and well, but what does that look like in practice? I don't have a full answer for you, but I'd like to share a story of one of the projects that the EDP's worked on that I think really demonstrates the possibility for rethinking public governance, especially. So we have the Western Cape here, and in 2018, sorry, the Western Cape government, through the Department of Health, started looking at a program that they called the whole of society approach. And they tested this approach in 4 sites, right? So they had one in Saldanha Bay. They also chose Drakensberg municipality, which is more in the Cape Winelands area. And then there were 2 sites that were chosen within the city of Cape Town Metro, Skylich and Hanover Park. And essentially what they said is they came up with this kind of story, this fictional story of a woman and a daughter, Carol and Lynn. And they imagined, they created an aspirational story where they imagined how Carol and Lindy's life would be if government worked together in a different way. And so the key thing that they held in terms of going through this program was, how would Carol and Lindy need government to work together in their community so that they could live happy and fulfilled lives? That was the central question that kind of guided this work. And my slides are about to get very wordy from here on, so I do apologize, but I want to tell the story properly. So there were a few key principles that this work was anchored on. Obviously, you know, what they embarked on, there was no World Bank report to say this is how you do it or things like this. They were building this practice. And so they said, well, we don't know what it's going to look like, but we can certainly say there are certain principles that we want to guide this work. So they said, well, the first is that we needed leadership from the top to buy into this process, but not only buy into it, to be part of the process. So what they did there was they had all the heads of department at Western Cape government. They put the whole of society approach principles into their performance contract. And each HOD, head of department, was designated to one of the 4 sites. So what you had is you had leadership, distributed leadership, with different HODs, regardless of what their mandate was or whatever, they were responsible for a site. It was also grounded in the principle of sharing mandates. So this is something that is often quite a barrier in terms of government collaborating, is, you know, we're always needing to work towards our own mandates. And so here it was about, well, how do we, instead of working as the representative for social development, how do we become actual representatives of government? Because communities, they don't care. They don't care if you work for a municipal department or provincial or national. They don't care. They just need government to work. It was also about saying, well, okay, this thing is new, right? So we need to learn through doing. We need to reflect on what these things are telling us, and we need to share knowledge, right? So it was about saying, this is new, we need to collaborate, but we need to learn and adapt the approach as we're moving along. It was rooted in this idea that there was a culture shift required. One that said, okay, you know, we're moving away from saying, I work in a silo and this is my silo, towards co-creation and collaborative ownership, right? It was about evidence-based decision-making. So as much as, you know, it was all these kind of softer things, it was also saying, how do we make decisions based on a collection of the data and the information and the intelligence that sits across our departments and across the spheres of government. It was about sustainability and scalability. So we have these 4 sites, but how do we take what we learn in here and kind of distribute it across government, you know, so that everyone in the province is working in this way? It was about thinking about how do we enter communities meaningfully. So instead of having a process that says, okay, you have to have an IDP process, there has to be so many community members for each and every site, it's about saying, well, what is the relationship with this community like? And what is a useful entry point given that context? It was about working according to the principles enshrined in the Constitution. It was saying, how do we do our work that ensures the principles of human rights, of fairness, of inclusion, of citizen-centric government is kind of present in everything that we do. And then, of course, the thing of really trying to align planning and resources within government, which has been a challenge that people have been kind of working towards for years. So then what did they actually do? So what they managed to do was they designed a network of communication, which focused on landing the approach with decision makers and people of influence so that they could understand what we were doing. WOZA was so new. So as much as we can say, of course, people need to work this way, there is nothing in government that enables this way of working. So it means that those who have the power and the authority to enable people to work this way on the ground, they need to kind of be brought into it and understand what it was that they were trying to do. They started with just sharing and understanding what everyone was doing. So in a place like Saldanha, for example, where I was most involved, you had provincial government working there, you had national government, you had local government people working there. Saldanha is quite a popular site for government intervention. And none of them knew what each other were doing. So you had a situation where municipalities didn't even know what provincial government was planning to do within their boundaries. And so the first thing that they just set out to do was just to say, guys, what are we all doing here? Then they started thinking about, okay, so how does these principles of WOZA translate into action? What does it look like if we do WOZA? The other thing that they did was establish a learning network. So across the 4 sites, they said, how do we make sure that we learn lessons across these sites? So it's not just within a site, but how can each site learn from the other? How are we building a network of knowledge sharing? And towards that end, they kind of identified and trained learning champions within each site that could share knowledge and raise the principles of WOZA within the municipality. So that's what they set out to do. So then what did they achieve really? Now I want to highlight that these guys were playing an infinite game. So that means that there's no end thing that we can look at and say, that's what they did. There's no bridge that was built. There's no stadium. There's no massive infrastructure investment. But what success looked like is that people started to join the dots between their mandates. They started to see the need to work collaboratively because the main realization was that the solution to our problems is not the sum of our parts. But in fact, what we find is that we work in a system where all of our actions are impacting and being impacted by each other's actions. There was also examples of real improved service delivery. The one that comes to mind is the GF Uester site hospital in Manenberg. It was a decommissioned hospital. And the intention was by Public Works that they were going to build a school there. Through this process and by getting everyone together at the site, they actually realized that it wasn't suitable for a school because there was a massive highway separating the site from the community, and kids would have to cross that highway, which would be very dangerous. So through the WOZA process, they managed to plan more effectively because then they moved the site of the school to a better location because you had the education people there, you had the community safety people there. It wasn't just the kind of public works people sitting in an office in town kind of planning what the site would look like. People got on the ground and they got a feel for what was happening. There were the relationships between the spheres of government were improved. So there was a better understanding of how they could help each other and why helping each other was important for all of them. And there was a real commitment to doing that. They also, you know, what we found is that people also were able to respond to emergencies much better. So in Saldanha Bay, for example, there were a number of protests where a clinic was burned and things like that. And because that was our site, they had a WhatsApp group. When the clinic was burned, the clinic had a direct line to the SAPS officials, they had a direct line to the municipality. The municipality could go and meet with the community and speak on behalf of the clinic because they knew exactly what their response would be. So in that way, they were actually able to be more effective in the response to these kinds of things. To me, though, the biggest success is that although WOZA in itself, you know, this project where people met all the time, etc., it doesn't exist in that same way. It's been applied for other projects. So you know, WOZA happened pre-COVID. Post-COVID, Western Cape government had a look at all its projects and it came up with these 3 priority areas: safety, well-being, and jobs, right? As a response, you know. And in the safety program, which is the one that I'm involved with now, the WOZA principles are the kind of bedrock of what we're doing in that program. And testament to that is that it's actually, that program is jointly run by the Department of Health and Community Safety. And that kind of stuff wouldn't have happened if people hadn't had this experience of WOZA. But that said, this wasn't a walk in the park. And there were a lot of kind of challenges that we experienced and a lot of things that didn't work. The first was, you know, getting people on board in the initial stages was a big challenge. People, you know, when we invited people to be part of WOZA, you know, it was just like people felt like this is another forum. I'm just going to sit there. People are going to report, etc., etc. And so people weren't keen. And so in a number of examples, we had to use that kind of authorization to almost force people to come to WOZA. And then once they were there, they experienced how it was different. And then that changed to a real commitment and a sense of mutual accountability within that team. It was really also hard to find time to connect and build the relationships required. So this was something that people did aside from their jobs, right? And as much as WOZA, the aim of WOZA was to enable people to actually do their jobs in an easier way, the road to getting there was one that required quite a bit of time because you had to build those relationships and build that structure. It was also difficult to get people to think about WOZA as an approach, not a project. So people kept, you know, people came to meetings and they're like, okay, so what are the projects? What are the WOZA projects? Can we identify the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things that we're going to do? Right? Because that's, government has always been very solutions oriented. And as a public sector official, you're made to feel you're very pressured to have a solution, right? And I remember in one meeting specifically, someone said, guys, our communities are burning. We can't just sit here and build relationships. And that was testament to the pressure people felt to do something. But at the same time, it was about acknowledging that like people have been doing something forever and the communities were still burning. So it was like, there's a real need to do this work, you know? So we established these learning champions, right? So we identified learning champions that would act within each municipality. What we found very quickly, though, is that the learning champions didn't always have the authority to play that role. So either they were someone who was too junior within a municipality, so they weren't at all the meetings, they couldn't influence their seniors and things like that. So the learning network only started to work because of the backbone support that the EDP could provide. So we then hosted learning networks. We managed a lot of the kind of learning components of WOZA. Cross-boundary travel was an issue. So as much as we said, okay, we're going to work in this was our way, the fact is that for the city of Cape Town, I think you need authorization from the very top level if you want to travel outside the boundaries of the city. And the similar was for the other municipalities. So it's like we want to work together, but we can't come together. So that was one of the challenges. And then scaling the approach beyond the people that were involved. And we're seeing some of that now in working with on the safety program. So everybody's said, okay, we are embracing the WUSA principles. Not everyone who's working in safety has had the experience of what that feels like. So that, you have to feel what it feels like to work in that way. And so the scaling of this approach beyond the people that were involved is still something that we're struggling with. Rika, I think this is my last slide. So what have we learned? So to me, above everything, despite the challenges, we've really learned that there is value in dedicating time to do this. There is what's happened in these sites, the relationships that have been built that sustain beyond WUSA still being in existence. It tells us that this kind of thing, it works, and there is something worth exploring around what a new way of doing public governance might look like. We also learned that instead of starting with the structure, which is kind of our common practice, so we start with the terms of reference, we ask people to nominate who must be on the steercom, all of those kinds of things, but instead of starting there, that governance must be informed by the problem we're trying to address. So it's about saying, if this is my issue, if the issue, for example, is safety, who needs to work together and how do they need to work together so that we can be effective in addressing this problem, right? We also said that building relationships is key. So we know that this thing would have failed if we hadn't built the relationships. But that requires commitment and time. Building relationships doesn't just happen. People need to be dedicated to that. They need to be dedicated to taking someone for a coffee, picking up the phone, doing all these things that are quite, they sit outside of our job description. We found that depending on the scale, this kind of work needed backbone support, right? So the EDP was quite central here, but the idea of governance, it needs to be seen as everyone's role. So it's like, who does governance? We all do governance. It's not this thing that's top down. We do governance in every single time we think about the project, we conceptualize action and things like that. We are framing a governance framework around that. So it's about all of us. We all actually do that, and we need to understand, I think about how we play a role in making that effective. And if you're testing this kind of thing out, you can't wait for a structure. We kind of said, okay, we're gonna build this bridge while we walk it. We did some things. Then we learned, okay, what does this tell us about the governance structure? Okay, and then we adapted as we go. So the governance, there was a loose governance structure that was started at the beginning of this process. And that was kind of adapted as the needs of the program changed, So then they created a new team here, or a new team there, or they changed things like that. And that's kind of, I would say that's a key principle, I would say, for this way of working. I think that's my last slide. But instead of leaving you with the general thank you last slide, I wanted to leave you with this. So this is the USAID Collaborate, Learn and Adapt framework. This framework was the guide for a lot of the work that was done under WUSA. So it says, it helps us think through what are the enabling conditions that we need to create. So that's your governance structure. What kind of governance structure do we need to create in terms of processes, in terms of sharing resources, etc., etc. And then what are the competencies that we need to build to work in that way? So it's about, this thing of collaboration. How do we build collaboration? How do we learn together? How do we pause and reflect, adapt our approach as we move along? So I wanted to leave you with this gift. And I hope you find it as helpful as we did. But that's the end of the formal presentation, Rika. I'm excited to hear what people think about this.
Thank you very much, Rushka. It was amazing to listen to you, and amazing from a perspective that we are putting together a short online training course on governance shortly. And just to hear the depth and the richness of your experience with experimenting with different ideas on governance and really taking it apart, departing from the literature on governance that's out there, using your own creative engagement with literature that comes from somewhere else, but then applying that to what if we could think about governance as a infinity game instead of a finite game. Mm-hmm. And then your experience with the whole of society approach in situ is that combination, I think, is really unique, and it's extremely refreshing to hear. And what I've been seeing in the chat is that there's a lot of resonance between what you've shared and people's experiences. So it's amazing to actually see someone working in these spaces, being creative and not forever complaining about how difficult and restrictive it is, and to say, well, how can we actually rethink this notion of restrictions as enabling, if these are our spaces and our forms and our structures that we have, how do we rethink all of that in order to start becoming alive, regenerative, active, inspirational, I would even add. So thank you extremely much for that. I think it's a really fantastic presentation. I'm going to look at the chats, and I think I'm just sort of connecting to what Nina Callahan was saying. She popped up Singapore in one of the in chats. I know that I've also had some engagement with people in Singapore in local government, where they've also, I think, were one of the sort of earlier case studies of using the WOZA approach, and the learnings from that. So Nina, I don't know if that's what you wanted to just flag, but then Nina also said one of her primary critiques of the new governance literature is that they find, or there's some kind of idea that function doesn't necessarily flow from form or structure, like you've explained. Therefore, our fascination with building institutions is not a guaranteed pathway to good governance. And that's what you've showed, but it's so ingrained in any project you're planning or any kind of implementation of anything, is that the focus is still on how do we support institutions towards good governance. Would you have any comment on, how your experiment or this, and what you're actually saying is that relationship and relationship building, and it's the softer things about how you show up in that space as a person, and allow the contextualities actually of the job that has to be done, not just collaboration, but putting out fires, that actually makes or gives form to this thing we call governance. Do you think it's impossible to do that without institutions, or not without institutions, but how do we rethink institutions almost to be able to embrace that kind of governance?
Yeah, I think the difficulty is that there's a level of comfortability that comes with that kind of traditional kind of governance, because you're very clear, what the rules are, and you're just like, okay, I'm gonna stick to these rules and then I'm okay, right? And the problem though is that more and more we're realizing that there is so much uncertainty that is rooted in our context. You know, not only are we sitting with the complex problems we've been sitting with for years, you know, not only are we sitting with that, but we're also sitting with the problem of we don't even know what things are going to look like in the next 5 years. COVID-19, I'm probably sure everyone's sick of hearing this as the example, but it is the example of how uncertain kind of our context is. No one saw it coming. And so I think that, I mean, institutions must exist. And all of those things that traditional governance is based on are important. Transparency is important. Accountability is important. Having control so that people don't take advantage of the system, those things are still important. They must exist. What I think we're advocating, though, is that they must exist with other things. They must exist with the ability for institutions to adapt to context. Governance must allow for that. It must allow for people to act in a way that is reflective of the challenges that we're currently experiencing. So we can't have these certain rules for an uncertain future. We can't have these kind of the silo approach to a complex issue. So it's about saying, how do we do that? The stuff of transparency and accountability and things like that, but then also enable institutions to function in a way that is responsive to the context. And that's my very vague answer to that question.
Yeah, no, that's a good answer, because I think it's it's that question of balancing seemingly opposite or contradictions in a sense, so that so that things can work and can it's the agonistics of the game in a sense. It's how do you stand in that tension of these differences and be able to act at the same time. I really like your answer. Okay, there's a bunch of questions coming in, and I'll try and just look through them and sort of see. There's one question by Mark Custers. How do your findings apply to ESG? I don't know what ESG is, or ESD structures and processes. Is this in place and being done? Is ESG a known term? No.
I feel like I heard it at some point, but I have no idea at this present time what ESG.
I give you time, Mark, to just maybe tell us what ESG is. I think we don't understand that. And then there's a question from Kevin Foster, who says he's a local government researcher, soon to be joining the CST as a PhD candidate. And he's wondering what the timeframes were between starting to engage with the WARSA approach and it starting to change decision-making. In other words, how long did it take for the realization of the GFUs to site to be used differently?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's this thing didn't happen linearly. So it took time for some, and then not so much for others. So we kind of started with Saldanha Bay, and Saldanha Bay was almost like the test site. And so they had gotten to a certain way of working, and then Drakenstein came on board. And actually what we found is they had adapted the approach very differently. And then there was a lot of lessons that Saldanha could learn from Drakenstein. So the whole WARSA process we engaged between 2018 and 2019. So it wasn't a very long period. It was about 2 years. And in that time, many of these things happened at different points, because it was like action started almost immediately with the few people that were already brought in. So we started where there was energy. And between those people, they started working differently. And then, from there it grew beyond that. I think with the US site, that was almost like the second time we took them on a site visit, the officials on a site visit. So it was very early in the game that they actually came to this realization. But in terms of certain, like what the timeframes were, it's very hard to answer that, because it didn't happen as neatly as that kind of answer would require.
Yeah, that's good too. I think we are, our minds are also often still so yeah, we want to see, that's the key question, is how do you replicate these things, or how do you pace these things, or how do you even budget for these approaches when our budgets are on a year-to-year annual base? We have to have our budgets and our financial statements. There's a long and huge discussion within the systems thinking community and complexity community to say, well, if we are planning to do implementation or change programs in this way, that's more messy, we should push so that our budgeting and finance reports shouldn't just measure us every year, but we should maybe extend those periods to also face the problems and the challenges that we have, and to say, well, let's report back or change budgeting to 1.5 year structures or 2 year structures, because often also these budgeting and reporting and evaluation structures that we have don't allow for experimental work to happen. And that comes back to what I think Mark also asked is, does the public accept this way of governance, or do we still want targets to be met as a measure of performance?
Yeah, it's the thing that we are still struggling with, I can say. And even now with the safety program, we're seeing that kind of happen. There's a tension between showing that we've done something and taking our time to get something right before we do anything. And I think that tension is going to sit with us for a long time. And it's again this thing of, it's not about waiting for the ideal conditions to start doing this kind of thing. You have to engage with it in the mess that already exists and find opportunities within that mess to change something. And hopefully at some point, that creates an opportunity to change something else, and that's kind of what experimentation, I think in the public sector in general requires. It needs for us to just find our space, and whether that space is a project that we're working on, or it's about saying, we know that all these constraints exist at an institutional level. There are 3 spheres of government enacting those constraints on a daily basis. We're not going to change that with our simple project. But what can we change that makes this more meaningful? And the monitoring and evaluation stuff, that's just something we haven't got to yet. So we haven't figured that one out yet. So if you guys have any suggestions, I'd love to hear them.
Yeah. Then I think that links to a kind of a critical question we have here by Anna Taylor, who says, many civic organizations like residents associations and the Water Caucus try to take a WOZA approach, but often it's government agencies who don't come to the table when asked by residents to work with them. Why does it take province to assert authority to get all the relevant stakeholders to participate? It seems the government, officials rather than politicians, is often only able to engage if it's on their terms as part of their processes and procedures. And all of these things don't often map onto things. She says she suspects the EDP can't do it everywhere across the province. Who else can play such intermediary roles other than the courts, which is where it ends up when WOZA approach is unsuccessful? Do you have any experience of that?
We've had a lot of experience of that, and I think, this critique is obviously one that exists of government in general. And I think, in working with government as an outsider, you start to understand where that culture comes from, and I find that there are lots of public sector officials that are trying to do something different, but that entire way that the institution itself has been set up is working against them. And it was mainly because there was leadership from the top that wanted to do this. And so it's difficult. Like, as much as I've worked in spaces where I've shared and heard the frustrations of the civil society, in wanting to get things done and, wanting to do things differently, and government coming up as a constant barrier. I've also had the opportunity of intimately engaging with what that means for officials and how difficult it becomes for them when, you know, your main aim is to make sure that you are compliant. Your main aim is not to get the organization in trouble. You know, these are deeply entrenched, long-standing ways of working where often, you know, a lot of officials don't feel that agency to be able to do things. There's a very risk-averse culture that's bred in government. And I'm not saying that as an excuse. We need to find ways of doing things differently. I'm just being empathetic to the context.
Yeah, thank you. I think it links also in the back of my mind. I remember the piece you wrote for the Daily Maverick on what does it take from you as a person to stand in that space and to operate in that space. And you have a kind of a list of, you know, what people bring to the space when they start engaging, when you're working on relations or when you're in, I think it's the food, the cans, community project. And that links, and what you've been saying also now links to the question Nina is asking is, can you talk about the element of individual courage and agency in the ways we pitch up in collaborations and approach the authorizing environment? This is not often the notion of courage, or the, you know, is not supported or encouraged in a constrained environment. What is your experience of that?
Yes, I would say I think that perfectly encapsulates the challenge, right? It's what we need is for people to stand up and say, I'm not doing these things. I'm not doing this like this anymore. I'm going to try something new. And I've seen it, so many examples of that, right? So I the other day I met a Brigadier Jones, who's a commander, a station commander in Bishop Lavis. And he started with this kind of WASA approach in his precinct. So he's gotten all the law enforcement people together, people from correctional services, guys from the city of Cape Town, Metro Police, and all of those guys. And he got them together, and they're now working together in the most amazing way in Bishop Lavis, right? And I don't know the difference between what makes Brigadier Jones kind of take that up that agency and other people not. There's an idea, I think it comes down to public entrepreneurship, right? So how do you become a public entrepreneur? So instead of a social entrepreneur, and there are examples. I think our work is about how do we spread that capacity, or as Keith Kruti calls it, the meta competencies required to be a public entrepreneur. How do you spread that across government? And I think that's what we're working on. But it's a long process. The EDP is about 14 people in our team. So you do need more intermediary organizations. They play an important role in also building the capabilities of people to say, I don't think anyone in the public sector gets up in the morning and doesn't think about the fact that they're trying to change things for communities. I think the challenge is that people, you know, they work in an institutional form that hasn't allowed them to build the capabilities to do that. And some people have, for whatever reason, I don't know, but most people haven't. And I think that, you know, that's the work, is like showing people what it looks like and helping them develop the skills to be able to do that.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a beautiful, beautiful place to close, which means, yeah, it's this deep connection that people have. Not like you say, it's not just doing governance as a project, but as an approach for how you show up as a person. And I think that's really what I've taken from you in your writings, in how you engage, and from your sharing today as well, is that you that you're saying that there's two ways in which we can show up. We can show up, makers of things, of projects with tick boxes, or we can start engaging from a much deeper space where our approach aligns with what the conditions and the context ask for. And that also asks from us not just to show up in functionary roles, but as whole people in a sense. And that's very, very much different than, just seeing things as projects to be managed. So thank you so much for sharing that, and also in how you presented that. You really gave us a sense for your energy and your passion and your excitement and your boldness and courage to stand in the space. So I really appreciate that, and thank you so much for sharing your time with us today.
Thank you, Rika. It's been fantastic. I'm so passionate about this work, and just thank you to everyone for listening to me today. I appreciate it.
Thank you. We'll follow up with you in a different way, and thank you everyone, all of people who participated, for your questions, your challenging and supporting questions, and for engaging. It's really wonderful to have you with us and share the space with you. And we'll be back in 2 weeks' time on another topic. But Rushka's video will be available on our CST website within a week's time or so. And we invite you to connect with that and share it as you go along. Thank you very much to everyone, and wishing you a great Thursday further.